My son showed me a video of my wife with two men on our very own bed. In that moment, I realized that what I had believed to be the truth might have only been a carefully staged play lasting more than 4 decades. My name is Edward Miller. I am 71 years old, and I live in Harmony Creek, North Carolina. Our small town rests among the lush green hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the air is pure and time seems to pass just a little slower. I retired 11 years ago, after 40 years of dedicated service with the United States Postal Service. My job had been to sort mail, making sure important messages reached the right person at the right address. At this age, I thought I had weathered every high and low life had to offer, but I was wrong. Every morning I woke before sunrise, a habit etched into me by decades of routine. I poured myself a cup of hot black coffee. Catherine, my wife, usually had a batch of freshly baked butter cookies and homemade strawberry jam waiting. We would sit on the porch, watch the sun peek over the hills, enjoy breakfast, and talk about the little things in life. Often, our conversations turned to Dorothy, our daughter who taught at Harmony Creek Elementary School, or to Peter, our youngest son, a gifted engineer working in Atlanta. I was proud of our town, of the simple summer festivals, the sweet smell of honeysuckle, and the laughter of children echoing through the streets. It was a simple, peaceful life I had built with Catherine over the last 42 years. Together we raised 3 successful children. Anthony, our eldest, was our greatest source of pride. He was a surgeon in Charlotte, a big city a few hours away. We often received pictures of the grandchildren through text messages, and Anthony never failed to call every week, telling us about his achievements. One quiet afternoon in early spring of 2019, I was reading the newspaper from my armchair in the living room while Catherine crocheted by the window when the landline rang. The sound cut through the familiar silence of our home. I picked it up. It was Anthony. His voice sounded tired and more strained than usual. He said he wanted to come home for a few days. "Dad, I'm dealing with some serious personal problems in the city. My wife Laura has filed for divorce, and she's fighting for custody of the kids. On top of that, I'm under investigation over a professional ethics complaint at the hospital. My career could be on the line." Catherine stopped her crocheting and looked at me, her face full of worry. I felt a sharp tightening in my chest. We were glad to hear that our son wanted to come home, but unease settled in as well. Anthony rarely came back alone, and certainly not in such a troubled state. He had always been the strong one, the confident one, never letting weakness show. A few days later, a familiar silver SUV pulled up in front of our house. Anthony stepped out. He looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes sunken, dark circles shadowing them. He hugged us, but the embrace no longer had the firm warmth it once did. He spoke vaguely about the pressures at work and his marital troubles, avoiding details. "Dad, things are a mess. I just want to stay home for a while." Catherine and I did our best to comfort him, setting up his room and giving him all the care we could. Catherine cooked beef stew and cornbread, his favorite meal from childhood. Anthony spent most of his time alone in his room, the door half closed. At night, I often heard the steady tapping of his laptop keyboard. Sometimes, I would see him step outside into the yard, whispering into the phone, keeping his distance so we couldn't hear. Once, I tried pressing him about the allegations at the hospital, and he snapped, "Dad, I'm dealing with complicated legal paperwork. I need privacy." I understood that my son was struggling and needed space. But Catherine didn't see it that way. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, she whispered to me, "Edward, our son didn't just come back out of nowhere. Something is going on. That's not the Anthony we know." I reassured my wife, insisting our son was simply exhausted, discouraged, and needed time to get through this difficult stage. One evening, I was sitting on the porch reading a novel, a cool breeze drifting through the branches of the old oak trees. Anthony suddenly sat down in the chair across from me. He asked about my old job at the post office. He wanted to know in detail about my routine trips to Charlotte back in the 1980 seconds, about my schedule, how long I was usually away from home, and the reasons for those trips. He asked with a strange kind of curiosity, not the way a son normally asks about his father's past. "Dad, do you remember the hotels you used to stay in? Did you usually send Mom letters during those trips?" I found it odd, but I didn't suspect anything. I just assumed my son was curious about an important chapter in my career. I told him about the letters I used to send Catherine, about the small gifts I would bring home from Charlotte. I had no idea that his questions and my innocent answers were opening the door to a secret I had never imagined. About a month after Anthony returned, the peace of Harmony Creek, which had always flowed like a slow-moving river, began to be stirred by hidden undercurrents. I felt a subtle change in the air of our household, an unusual rhythm weaving itself into our daily life. Tiny cracks began to appear on the seemingly solid walls of my home. Anthony continued to shut himself away in his room. The door was always slightly ajar or completely closed. Every night I would hear the steady tapping of keys on his laptop. That sound echoed through the silence of the house, like a strange, uninvited tune that kept me awake. Sometimes I saw him out in the yard at dusk, standing in a shadowed corner near the rose bushes, whispering into his phone. His voice was always low, never clear enough for me to catch the words from the porch. One time, I walked out to him. "Who are you talking to, Anthony?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though unease had already crept into my chest. Anthony flinched, quickly hanging up. He turned to face me, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Just my lawyer, Dad," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "I'm dealing with some complicated legal papers related to the divorce and the hospital allegations. I need a little privacy for this, you understand?" I nodded. "All right, son, I understand." But inside, I didn't truly understand. Anthony had always been straightforward, always open. This evasiveness wasn't him. I felt as though a thin veil had been draped over my son. A few days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Catherine and I drove to visit Dorothy and the grandchildren in the neighboring town. When we returned home around 5 o'clock, something made me stop right at the threshold. The door to my study, a small room where I kept important documents, family keepsakes, and a little emergency savings, was ajar. Normally, I always kept that room locked tight. I stepped inside. The sight froze me in place. The drawers of the old filing cabinet were pulled wide open, papers scattered across the floor. I hurried to check. Insurance contracts, property deeds, savings books. Nothing was missing, but everything was disturbingly out of order, as if someone had rifled through them in a rush and hadn't bothered to put anything back. Catherine stood in the doorway, clutching her chest. "Who did this?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with shock. Anthony, who had been in his room, heard the commotion and came out. He leaned casually against his bedroom doorway, his expression strangely calm. "What's going on, Mom, Dad?" he asked, showing no real surprise. "My study's been ransacked," I said, locking eyes with Anthony, trying to read something in his gaze. "Did you see anyone in here?" Anthony shrugged indifferently. "I was just looking for some old documents, Dad. Maybe something about our family records or genealogy for my divorce filings. I thought they might be in your filing cabinet." Catherine stepped forward, her eyes filled with suspicion as she looked at Anthony. "Anthony, our family has rules. Your father's study is his private space. You have no right to go through his things." Her voice was firm and unyielding. Anthony looked offended, his expression turning sour. "Mom, I was only looking for some documents." "What's the big deal? Don't you and Dad trust me?" "I just wanted to find some evidence about the stability of our family. I tried to ease the tension." "Come on, Catherine. Maybe Anthony was just careless." But deep down, I felt a small spark of unease and suspicion. Searching for genealogy documents, yet turning the entire study upside down? Or was he really looking for something else? 2 weeks later, while Catherine was rearranging the family photo albums on the living room shelf, she suddenly let out a small cry. I rushed over. She was holding an open album, her hands trembling, her face pale. "Edward," she said, her voice breaking, "some of the old photos are missing. The ones from when we first got married. The photos from the early years." She pointed to the blank spaces on the album pages. "Edward, why those pictures? Where did they go?" A chill ran down my spine. An indescribable sense of dread took hold of me. I went to find Anthony again. "Son," I said, trying to stay calm even though my heart was pounding faster, "some of your mother's old photos are missing from the album. Do you know anything about this?" Anthony spun around, his face full of anger, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you both keep suspecting me? I'm your son. I would never do anything to harm this family. Mom must have just misplaced them somewhere." He spoke with a fury I had never seen in him before. But this time, Anthony's denial no longer convinced me. His reaction was too intense, too explosive, as if he were trying to hide a terrible secret. I began to notice the way Anthony looked at Catherine. It was not the gaze of a son toward his mother, but a scrutinizing, judging look, sometimes carrying a flicker of resentment. Anthony would sit at the dining table, his eyes narrowed, staring at Catherine while she spoke to Dorothy on the phone. Catherine sensed it too, and she avoided being alone with Anthony as much as possible. At night, she would often whisper to me, "Edward, our son is plotting something. He has changed so much. He looks at me as if he knows some secret about me." The atmosphere in the house grew heavy. The laughter and conversation that once filled our meals faded away completely. Anthony remained silent, unreadable. Sometimes during dinner he would suddenly drop cryptic remarks. A perfect appearance is sometimes just a veil hiding rot within. Those words would sink the entire table into silence. Catherine and I would glance at each other, not daring to respond, while only the sharp clinking of silverware against plates echoed through the room. The tension in the family kept building to the point of being unbearable. Catherine became quieter, restless, unable to sleep. She would pace back and forth in the living room at midnight like a bird trapped in a cage. Anthony stayed silent and unreadable, occasionally smirking when he noticed his mother's distress. Our other children, Dorothy and Peter, began to notice the change. Dorothy called me every day. "Dad, is Mom all right?" "Why has Anthony become so strange?" Peter asked the same. I tried to talk to him, but he just avoids me. "What's going on, Dad?" All I could say was that Anthony was going through a difficult phase, but I knew my answer no longer convinced anyone, not even myself. A darkness was settling over our home, and I felt as though I was walking through a thick fog. That night, as I passed by Anthony's room, I saw the door slightly ajar. A dim light spilled out from inside. I stopped and listened. I heard the rustling of papers. Then came a voice, Anthony's voice, loud and clear. At last, I finally found it. Startled and confused, I tried to peer inside. In his hands, he was holding an old tape, covered in dust. In July 2019, 4 months after Anthony returned, we celebrated Catherine's 67th birthday. Dorothy and Peter came with their grandchildren as well. The atmosphere seemed cheerful, but Catherine and I still felt a heaviness, an invisible thread of tension. I noticed Catherine occasionally glancing at Anthony, her eyes flickering with fear. Anthony, on the other hand, appeared unexpectedly friendly, even presenting his mother with a silk handkerchief. Catherine thanked him politely, but I knew she was not at ease. At dinner, while everyone was talking, Anthony suddenly raised his glass. The table fell silent. He stared straight at Catherine, his eyes glinting in a frightening way. "To Mother, Catherine," he said in a strange, loaded tone, "I wish you health to keep all the beautiful memories, and also the ones nobody ever wants to mention." The toast was laced with sarcasm, and it cast a heavy silence over the table. Catherine's face went pale, her trembling hands dropping the handkerchief. A chill ran down my spine, and I could not understand what my son was trying to say. After that toast, Anthony continued to make cryptic remarks. "A perfect surface can sometimes hide the deepest cracks, Dad," he said, his gaze sliding toward his mother. Then he turned to me. "Are you sure you really know everything about the woman you married, after all these years?" Anger rose sharply in me. "What do you mean, Anthony? If you have something to say it straight out." I tried to keep my voice steady. Anthony only gave a cold smile. "Everything has its time, Dad. Everything has its time." Then he turned away. A few weeks later, on Thursday, the 12th of September 2019, the town was buzzing with preparations for the festival. I went out to take care of some banking. When I came back home around 4 p.m., I was struck by the silence. Catherine wasn't in the kitchen. Her purse lay on the table, which was strange. Just then, I heard an argument from the back room. The door was ajar, and I heard Catherine's choked voice. "You have no right to do this." "That happened a long time ago." "Why now?" Anthony's voice was cold and sharp. "You think everything will stay buried forever? You think you can deceive people for a lifetime?" Catherine's voice was filled with despair. "What do you want? What do you want from me after all these years?" Anthony's reply came clearer, brimming with cruel satisfaction. "I want Dad to know the truth, Mother. I want him to know everything. I moved quietly toward the door and pushed it open. Catherine was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face streaked with tears, looking shattered. Anthony stood there, holding an old VHS cassette. He smiled coldly when he saw me. "Ah, you're home, Dad? I've been waiting for you for a long time." Catherine jumped up and rushed toward me, her trembling hands clutching my arm. "Edward, don't believe him. Don't listen to him. He's trying to destroy everything." I looked at Catherine, then at Anthony and the videotape in his hand. "Catherine, what is going on?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Anthony stepped closer to me, still wearing that same smile. "Your son, the one who loves you so much, has brought you a gift, Edward. You should have seen it a long time ago." He handed me the VHS tape. "Watch it for yourself." Catherine went pale, her breathing quick and uneven. "Don't take that, Edward," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not worth it, not after all these years." I took the VHS tape in my hand. It was heavy, and I could feel its age in the rough plastic. Anthony stepped back. "Go on, Dad. The truth can be painful, but it will also set you free." I stared at the tape, my hands shaking. There was an old, faded, handwritten label on it that read Summer '88. Next to it, tied loosely with a frayed thread, was something I recognized instantly. The silver bird-shaped brooch I had given Catherine on our first wedding anniversary in Springfield in 1978. "Where did you find this?" I asked Anthony, holding up the brooch. "This brooch has been missing for more than 40 years. "It wasn't lost," Anthony said slowly. "It was given to someone else, then kept like a trophy. Look at the tape, Edward. Look closely." I looked at Anthony, then back at the tape. "What does this mean?" I asked Catherine, my voice shaking. Anthony stepped closer, leaning down and pointing at the words Summer '88 on the label. "And here's the best part, Dad. This wasn't the first time." He glanced at Catherine, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "So my entire life, everything I had believed in, could it all have been one enormous lie?" I played the tape, and my entire world collapsed right there in my own home. The silver hairpin, everything I believed about Catherine, about our marriage, shattered. "What does this mean, Catherine?" I asked, my voice hoarse, my eyes fixed on the images playing on the TV. The video began with my Catherine, with Charles Davis, on our very own bed. Then the footage shifted, and I saw my Catherine with another man, again on that same bed. It was Thomas, my brother. Catherine sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. "Edward, it was a long time ago. It was a terrible mistake." Anthony stepped forward, a cruel smile curling his lips. "Tell Dad the truth, Catherine. Tell him how you cheated on him for months with that insurance salesman. Tell him how you wore the very hairpin Dad gave you during those meetings. And tell him what Uncle Thomas did to you on Mom and Dad's bed, right, Mom? Shut up!" Catherine screamed, springing to her feet, her eyes red and swollen. "You don't know anything!" I stood frozen. Catherine had betrayed me, on video, in our bed, with two men, one her lover, the other my brother. And Anthony, my own son, had kept this secret, and now he was exposing it. "How did you get this tape?" I asked Anthony. Anthony shrugged. "I stumbled across it. A rage I couldn't control erupted inside me." He had held onto this tape, only to show it to me now? "Why, Anthony? What kind of son does that?" Anthony looked at me, his eyes heavy with bitterness. "The kind of son who's always been abandoned, Dad. I wanted you to know that your perfect life isn't what you think it is." "Is it true? Did you betray me?" I asked Catherine. She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "In 1988, you were gone all the time with your postal assignments, Edward. I felt so lonely, so lost. You slept with Charles and Thomas? He forced himself on you in our bed?" The question spilled out, my voice trembling as the horrifying truth surfaced. Catherine looked at me, tears streaming. 3 times in 2 months with Charles. Then I stopped. It was the biggest mistake of my life. As for Thomas, it was one afternoon when you weren't home. He showed up. I turned him down, but he forced a kiss on me, Edward, and he recorded it. Right on our bed. I didn't know what to feel. More than 30 years had passed. Had it all been a lie? "Get out of my room," I told Anthony, my voice soft but firm. "Get out of my house today." Anthony was stunned. "I'm telling you the truth, and you're throwing me out." "You're not doing this to help me," I replied. "You're doing it out of malice, out of jealousy." "What kind of man does that, Anthony?" He was about to argue back, but I cut him off. "I want you to pack your things and leave my house before nightfall." Anthony glared at me with hatred, then slammed the door shut. I stood there, holding the VHS tape, feeling as if the sky had been torn open. Catherine hesitated, then stepped closer. "Edward, not now," I said as I backed away. "I need to think. I need to be alone." I left the house, wandering aimlessly through the festival-filled streets of Harmony Creek. Every laugh, every note of music became a distant, painful noise. Eventually I stopped at First Harmony Creek Church, sat down on a back pew, and stared at the altar. 42 years of marriage. A lifetime. Trust was like glass. Once broken, the cracks never disappeared. I returned home late. Anthony was gone. Catherine sat in the kitchen, her eyes swollen from crying. "Edward, please, we need to talk." I sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm listening," I said. "The longest and most painful night of our marriage began." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" was her first question. Catherine held a cold cup of coffee, her hands trembling. She explained her fear of losing me and the family, and how after so many years, speaking the truth seemed meaningless. 30 years of secrets?" I muttered. She nodded. "Not a day goes by that I don't regret it, Edward. You've always been a good husband." "Then why?" I asked. "If you were so good, why did you look for another man? And why did Thomas dare to do that with you, in our bed?" Catherine drew a deep breath. It was 1988. "I felt invisible, Edward. You were traveling for work all the time, never asking about me, never noticing the changes. Even at home, you didn't seek me out. When life grows busy and invisible gaps appear, hasn't each of us at some point longed for attention, for recognition, or simply for a look that truly saw us?" She told me about meeting Charles Davis, an insurance salesman. He listened, made her feel noticed. Things developed until Charles kissed her in the town square, and she had been wearing the brooch I gave her. Catherine described 3 intimate encounters with Charles, always on the days I was away on business, and how guilt finally forced her to end it. Charles threatened to expose her, but eventually left town. "What you don't know," Catherine said, "is that Thomas, your younger brother, came to see me at that time." "Thomas?" "Yes, Edward. While you were away, Thomas came. He knew I was lonely. He tried to force himself on me, Edward, and he recorded it right there on our bed. Then he used that tape to blackmail me. So this is what it comes down to: blackmail carried out by my own brother, including that vile act." Catherine explained that she had given Thomas the hairpin and some of her savings in exchange for his silence. He had promised to destroy the video and never speak of it again, but he hadn't. I think he was waiting for the right moment. I stood up and walked to the window. Maybe an old betrayal like this could erase everything, I thought to myself. "There's something else I need to tell you," Catherine said from behind me. "Maybe it explains why Thomas has held this grudge for so many years." I turned to her. "Explain what?" "Thomas always wanted me, Edward," Catherine said, her eyes distant. "Even when we were dating, he was jealous of you. And when he did that horrible thing in 1988, he believed he would win, that he would have me." I had to sit down again, stunned. "My own brother? I rejected him after that," Catherine said. "I told him I loved you. He got furious, said awful things. I never told anyone. Everything began to make sense. Thomas's resentment, the way he treated Catherine. It wasn't only jealousy toward me. It was also the bitterness of a man rejected by a woman he wanted. And when he had the chance to use that tape to blackmail you and keep tormenting you, that was his revenge. And now," I concluded, feeling the anger rise inside me, "Anthony, our son, found that video among Thomas's old things after he died. He has been waiting for the right moment to finish Thomas's mission of revenge, to destroy us." A few days after Catherine's night of confession, our house sank into a heavy silence. I spent most of my time on the porch, looking out at the rolling hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, trying to piece together the fragments in my mind. I thought about Catherine's words, about her loneliness, about my constant business trips. I remembered what my father, who had passed away many years ago, once told me about forgiveness in marriage. Marriage isn't built on perfection. It's built on forgiveness. I realized then that I didn't want to lose Catherine. I walked into the kitchen, where Catherine sat quietly, her eyes still swollen. "I need time, Catherine," I said, my voice still weighed down. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I don't want to throw away 42 years of marriage over something that happened more than 3 decades ago." Catherine nodded, tears sliding down her face again. A sorrowful acceptance seemed to envelop her. I asked Catherine about her relationship with Anthony when he was young. "He was always a sensitive, intelligent child," Catherine said, her voice distant, but also so easily hurt. "I put too many expectations on him, Edward, expecting him to be perfect like you, to become the pride of our family. Maybe I overlooked his feelings and needs, making him feel like he was never good enough." She looked at me, her eyes full of regret. "I was so obsessed with proving I was the perfect mother that I forgot my child needed to be loved in a genuine way too, Edward." That confession pierced my heart with a sharp pain, part of it my own. I decided to go find Anthony. I needed to confront him, to understand what drove him to such cruel actions. I found him sitting in a small coffee shop in Harmony Creek, a place he rarely visited. He was staring into the cup of coffee in front of him, his face twisted into a strange look of satisfaction, as if he had just completed something important. He wasn't surprised to see me walk in, but he wasn't warm either. "What are you doing here, Dad?" he asked, his voice cold. I sat down in the chair across from him. "I want you to explain, Anthony. Explain the real reason behind what you did." Anthony looked at me, his eyes glittering with anger, his expression still defiant. "Explain? I've lived my whole life under your perfect shadow. Do you understand that? A father who was always right, a saintly mother, a perfect family that was nothing but a lie." He tapped his finger on the table. "You were always the model father, the pride of everyone, and I was always the troublemaker, the failure." "I chose my own path, Anthony," I replied. "My choice?" Anthony let out a bitter laugh. "Or was I forced into it? Do you even know what it feels like to grow up under the shadow of a perfect sibling? Always compared, always looked down on. Mom always wanted me to outdo Dorothy, to be as successful as Peter. I had to be Anthony, the brilliant Dr. Miller, the pride of the family." Tears began to stream down his face. "I tried, Dad. I tried to live up to the perfect image you and Mom wanted, but it was all a lie." He spoke of the times he felt abandoned, overlooked, the invisible weight he carried just to play the role of the exemplary eldest son. "I never felt loved for who I really was, Dad, only for what I could achieve. I always fought for that proud look in your eyes, but it was never enough," Anthony went on, his voice filled with bitterness. "When my marriage and career fell apart, when Laura wanted a divorce, when I was under investigation at the hospital, it felt like my whole world collapsed. I realized the perfect life I'd built was nothing but a sham. And then I found that VHS tape among Uncle Thomas's old things after he died, Dad. I watched it. I saw everything. Mom and Charles. And Uncle Thomas too, Dad. I watched it. I saw it all." He pointed at the photos and the brooch I was holding. "I wanted you to know that your perfect life was just a farce. I wanted you to know the truth. I listened to my son, torn between anger and pain, with a flicker of understanding for the misery he had endured. I realized that perhaps Catherine and I had unknowingly contributed to his suffering by placing too many expectations on him, by overlooking his silent cries for help. But I couldn't accept the destruction Anthony had caused. "That doesn't excuse what you've done, Anthony," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You can't use your pain as a weapon to destroy the happiness of others. You broke the most sacred trust in this family." I looked straight into his eyes. "I still love you, Anthony. You are my son. But I don't want you in my life until you are ready to face your mistakes and sincerely seek healing." Anthony stared back at me, his expression torn between rage and regret, his eyes red once again. He couldn't say another word. At last, he stood up, turned his back, and walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with my turmoil and my quiet, throbbing grief. I watched as his figure faded down the cobblestone path of Harmony Creek. He left carrying his own anger and bitterness, but behind him he left an even greater fracture. I knew I would not sleep that night. Would I ever be able to mend what had shattered between us? And how could I heal a wound that had cut so deep into my own flesh and blood, when it had been gnawed at by pain from its very roots? In the first days after the night Anthony left, our house sank into a cold silence. It was a silence unlike the peaceful kind we once knew. It was more like the echo of a scream being held back. Catherine and I lived under the same roof, but there was an invisible wall between us. We ate separately, Catherine in the kitchen, while I usually carried my meal out to the porch. I had been sleeping on the sofa in the living room since that night. Every time I looked at Catherine, even for just a fleeting moment, I felt a sharp pain as memories of the VHS tape and Anthony's words came rushing back. Catherine could see it too in my eyes. She would lower her head, tormented by guilt and regret, her face so worn and drawn that I hardly recognized her anymore. A week passed in that torment. One morning, as I sat drinking coffee, Catherine came to sit beside me, her eyes red but determined. "Edward," she said, her voice hoarse, "we can't go on like this." I looked at her. "I know. I don't want to lose you," she went on, her lips trembling. "We've had 42 years. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I don't want to throw it all away." "I don't want to lose you either, Catherine," I replied, a sharp ache rising in my chest. "But I don't know how to get past this. I don't know how to trust you again." "I don't know either," she said, "but we need help. We can't do this on our own." I nodded. It was a truth we could not deny. We began searching for a psychologist who specialized in marriage counseling. Harmony Creek was a small town. There weren't many options, but we found Dr. Evelyn Hayes in Asheville, a larger city about an hour's drive away. On the morning of our appointment with Dr. Hayes, Catherine and I drove to Asheville in near total silence. We didn't talk much. Only the soft sound of the radio playing gentle music filled the car. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts and emotions. The first therapy session was difficult. Dr. Hayes, a calm and compassionate woman with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed us into her warm office. "Hello, Edward." "Hello, Catherine," she said, her voice gentle. "Thank you both for coming. Let's begin by sharing what has been weighing on your hearts." Catherine was the first to speak. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to say everything. She laid bare her fears, the guilt that had tormented her for 30 years. She spoke of the deep loneliness she felt in 1988, when I was consumed by my new job and endless trips to Charlotte. She told me about Charles, about the secret meetings, about the brooch. She also explained how Thomas had filmed that video and used it to blackmail her, and then about Anthony's ruthless revelation. "I've kept this secret for so many years, Doctor Hayes," she said as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I've lived in fear, and now everything has shattered. It was my turn. I shared the pain of betrayal, the feeling that everything I had believed to be true was nothing but a lie. I spoke about 42 years of marriage, about how I thought I knew Catherine better than I knew myself. I expressed my disappointment in Anthony, in the way my own son had tried to destroy us with that videotape. "I feel like my heart has been ripped in two," I said, my voice breaking. "I cannot believe Catherine, but I also cannot believe my own son would do something like that." In moments like this, when trust is shaken to its very core, is love strong enough to mend everything, or are we left only with the broken pieces of a past that cannot be restored? Dr. Hayes listened patiently, never interrupting us. When we finished speaking, she nodded. "Forgiveness does not mean forgetting," she began, her voice calm but steady. "It means choosing to move forward in spite of the pain. It is a process, not a single event. A marriage that has lasted more than 40 years has deep roots, Edward, Catherine, like an old oak tree. It can be shaken by a powerful storm. It may lose a few branches, but it is very hard to uproot if the roots remain strong." Her words planted a faint glimmer of hope in me. In the sessions that followed, Catherine was able to share more about the feelings of abandonment she had carried since her youth, the sense of being invisible while I was too focused on my career, the fear of growing older without ever truly living. "I feel like I lost part of my youth, Edward," she said during one session. "I want to be seen, to be valued, to feel like I still matter." I also expressed my deep disappointment in Anthony, about how I felt I had failed to truly understand my son. "I thought I was a good father," I told Dr. Hayes, "but maybe I was too focused on success on the outside and forgot what was happening inside him." Dr. Hayes helped us understand that this process was painful, like cleaning out an old wound that had never been properly treated. But it was necessary in order to begin healing. Each session was a difficult step. Yet with every step we came to understand each other a little more, and most importantly, to understand ourselves. We knew the journey ahead would be long, but at the very least we had begun to walk it. In the days that followed, Catherine and I tried to rebuild our daily routines, but everything felt different. We started sharing the same bed again, which was a big step after so many weeks of me sleeping on the couch. There was no physical intimacy at first, only the presence of each other, a fragile comfort we were trying to piece back together. We made an effort to talk more, to share about our days, about small things happening around town. Every time Catherine told a story, I still found myself looking at her with questioning eyes. But Catherine didn't avoid it. She faced it with remorse and a surprising patience. She knew I needed time to trust her again. In 2020, a global event struck and changed everyone's lives, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Harmony Creek, like so many other places across the country, was hit hard. Stores shut down, the streets were empty. Catherine and I were forced to isolate at home, limiting how much we went out, which meant we had to spend more time together than ever before. At first, it only added to the tension. There was no escape, no personal space, only the walls of this house, where old secrets and that videotape still haunted us. Yet, through the long months of isolation, something strange happened. Catherine and I slowly began to find joy again in small things. We started playing chess every afternoon, sitting for hours at the old wooden table in the living room. At night we rewatched our favorite TV dramas, laughing at the worn-out lines and familiar plot twists. Catherine taught me how to make apple pie the way my mother used to bake it, with the scent of cinnamon and apples filling the house. In the chaos and fear of the outside world, we found our own peace within these walls. Catherine became more patient, more open in her conversations. I also felt myself opening up, sharing more of my thoughts and feelings. In 2021, a year after the pandemic began, our lives faced another trial. I suffered a minor stroke. Nothing too severe, thank God, but enough to keep me in the hospital for a while and require rehab afterward. I felt my body weak, unable to respond the way I wanted. It was a frightening time. But Catherine was there, never leaving my side. She cared for me with devotion day and night. She stayed with me in the hospital, reading books to me, wiping the sweat from my forehead. When I came home, she patiently helped me through physical therapy, encouraging me whenever I wanted to give up. She celebrated every tiny bit of progress I made, each time I could lift my arm on my own or take a single step. It was during that recovery that I realized, more deeply than ever, that I had made the right decision in forgiving Catherine. I saw that her love and dedication had never changed. She never abandoned me in my hardest moment. She was here, strong and steadfast, despite everything we had gone through because of that old tape. One night, as Catherine was helping me exercise my arm, she looked at me with tender eyes. "Edward," she said, "the elders here say that love is like piloncillo, sweet but not always gentle. Sometimes it makes your teeth ache, but the taste it leaves behind is worth it." I nodded, feeling a profound peace seep into me. Maybe the cracks, the pain of the past, had truly made the flavor of this love deeper and more meaningful. We had weathered another storm together, but I knew that somewhere out there the dark clouds of the past still lingered. I still didn't know how they would affect my son, Anthony, and whether that videotape still held the power to wound us again. The laughter of the grandchildren echoed across the backyard, blending with the soft notes of country music. The summer sun in Harmony Creek cast a golden glow over the lawn, highlighting the flowers Catherine had cared for. I sat on the porch swing, taking in the familiar faces around me, feeling the warmth of the moment. The year 2022 marked the 45th wedding anniversary of Catherine and me. We held a small gathering to give thanks for life. Even though Anthony was not there, both Catherine and I felt a deep sense of peace. The wounds were slowly healing, and we had learned how to live with the scars the past had left behind. As the sun set, our daughter Dorothy stood and offered a heartfelt toast. "To my parents," she said, her voice warm and sincere, "who taught us that true love is not perfect, but it endures. You showed us that marriage is not sustained only by moments of joy, but especially by moments of hardship." Catherine and I looked at each other. Her words touched us deeply, perfectly capturing the journey we had lived through together. After the party, once everything had quieted down, Catherine surprised me with a small gift. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled mysteriously. "Open it and you'll see." Inside the box was a new brooch, shaped like a bird, golden, with tiny blue details. "To replace the old one, Edward," she explained. "A symbol of our new beginning, just like you said that day." I was speechless, moved. "It's perfect," I whispered. "Nothing is perfect, Edward," Catherine replied, holding my hand. "But that can still be true, and that is worth far more." I looked at her, feeling a love deeper than ever before, a love that had been tested and proven. That night I sat on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky as the crickets chirped. My thoughts drifted back to Thomas, my younger brother who had passed away years earlier. I remembered Catherine's confession about how Thomas had recorded that video and used it to blackmail her, about his disgusting attempt to force himself on her in my own bed. I also recalled the confrontation with Anthony and realized that Thomas, like Anthony, had been consumed by jealousy and the sense of being overshadowed. Thomas had always felt he wasn't good enough, always living in the shadow of me, the so-called perfect older brother. Had I in some way contributed to that pain for my brother? Was my perfection a burden to him, just as it now was to Anthony, driving them both toward destruction instead of growth? I realized that everyone carries flaws, their own wounds. Compassion was not only for Catherine, it was for Thomas too, and maybe one day I would need to open my heart to Anthony as well. I no longer felt the old resentment toward Thomas or Anthony. Instead, there was a sad acceptance of the complicated nature of being human. Life is too short to cling to hatred. I had learned that lesson painfully, but in learning it, I also found peace. I stood up, looking out at the backyard where the little lantern still glowed softly. Although we had weathered so many storms, I still thought about Anthony. He was still my son, my own flesh and blood. He had delivered me a painful truth, yet in doing so, he had indirectly helped Catherine and me mend our bond. I knew that one day, I would have to reach out to him again, not with anger, but with a heart that had learned forgiveness. Still, I did not yet know how. Would Anthony ever find peace within himself? Or would the pain rooted deep inside him always torment him, keeping him from returning to his family, to the light of forgiveness? The spring of 2023 brought Catherine and me an immense joy, an event that lifted some of the shadows of the past, the birth of our first great-granddaughter. She was Anthony's child. He had named his daughter Mary Catherine, a name both traditional and reverent. Anthony stopped by the hospital to see his baby girl, a brief visit. The meeting between my wife, myself, and Anthony was still strained. He spoke little and kept his distance. Yet in the way he looked at that newborn child, I caught a faint warmth, a softness I thought had long vanished. Catherine and I felt boundless happiness as we held that tiny little girl in our arms, singing the same lullabies Catherine once sang to our children, then to our grandchildren. Catherine leaned close to my ear, her voice a whisper, full of love and hope. "We will keep overcoming these things, Edward. When we are no longer here, a part of us will remain in her children, and in her children's children." I nodded, gazing at the small face, sleeping soundly in my arms. This, I thought, this was immortality, not in books or monuments, but in the bloodline, in the stories, in the traditions passed down from one generation to the next. At the start of 2024, a difficult decision was made. We would sell the house in Harmony Creek. It was not an easy decision. That house had witnessed nearly our entire lives, from the time we were newly married, to our children growing up, and then the births of our grandchildren. Every corner, every crack in the walls, carried a memory, but maintaining such a large space had become too much for two people our age. We decided to buy a smaller, easier-to-maintain house near our daughter Dorothy. "It will be easier for her to come and help take care of us," I told Catherine, trying to find a practical reason to hide the sadness. "And we will be closer to the grandchildren, too." Moving felt like a ritual of transition. Every item we packed carried a story, a memory. We spent weeks sorting through everything, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Some things we chose to leave behind, like the old dining table used only for special occasions, or the faded lace curtains Catherine insisted on replacing every time she washed them twice a year. "They've served their purpose, Edward," she said, placing the old curtains into a large box. "Now it's time for something new. Other things, like the family photo albums, the handmade toys from the grandchildren, or my old banjo, had been carefully packed, ready to follow us into this new stage of life. Among the things we found while cleaning out the dusty old attic was a small oak box I had long forgotten. Catherine opened it. Inside, resting neatly on a piece of worn velvet, was the old hairpin, a tiny silver bird. That pin had once been a symbol of love, later evidence of betrayal, and eventually a tool for blackmail. Catherine looked at it, her face showing a flicker of hesitation, unsure of what to do. "It holds all of this, Catherine," I said, touching the pin lightly. "It's part of our story, at the end of every chapter of it." Catherine gave a sympathetic smile, one of acceptance. She placed the little box with the rest of the things we were taking to the new house. A part of the past, not forgotten, but put away in the right place, no longer able to hurt us. Our new home was smaller, but warm and welcoming. It had a small yard where Catherine grew her favorite herbs and flowers, and a porch where I often sat watching the sunset in the late afternoons. The neighbors were kind. Many already knew us from the church or the town market. Life at 77 had a different rhythm, slower, more reflective. There were days of aching joints, fading memory, and a body that didn't always respond the way I wanted, but there was also a calmness that came with age, a wisdom only time could give. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the oak branches, I received a letter. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, only my name written carefully by hand. I opened it. Inside was a small card. Is this the beginning of a new chapter of healing, or just another reminder of wounds that never truly healed? August 2025, and I, Edward Miller, am now 78 years old. Catherine, my wife, is 74. Nearly half a century has passed since the day we said "I do" at First Harmony Creek Church. This afternoon, we sat on the porch of our new home, a smaller, cozier place nestled among old oak trees. The sun was setting behind the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange, purple, and soft pink. The air was cool and gentle, carrying the scent of cut grass and night-blooming jasmine. I felt a profound serenity, a peace I had finally found after so many storms. Catherine suddenly held my hand, her thin but warm fingers lacing tightly through mine. "Thank you for never giving up on us, Edward," she said, her voice soft like a whisper carried by the evening breeze. Her eyes rested on me, the wrinkles at their corners telling the story of an entire lifetime, no longer shadowed by fear or regret, but only by sincerity. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm the one who's grateful, Catherine," I replied, my voice trembling slightly, "for every day, every year, every decade we've been together. And yes, I am thankful for every single moment of our journey, even the hardest ones, because it was those very moments that brought us here, to this doorway, to this sunset, to this peace we share now." I looked out toward the dark green trees silhouetted against the changing sky. True love, I had learned, was not an unshakable, everlasting feeling like the fairy tales claim. It was not a flawless path covered in roses. Love is a choice you make every day, each morning when you wake up and look at the person beside you. A choice to stay, a choice to forgive, a choice to begin again if needed. A choice to see in your partner not just flaws and mistakes, but their essence, their true humanity. Catherine and I were never perfect, not once. We were human, capable of error, complicated, full of contradictions. But we learned how to love each other's imperfections, to accept that life does not always bend to our will. And perhaps that is the real beauty of love, complete acceptance. I remembered my father's words, spoken long ago before he passed. He once told me, when I was young and ambitious, "Son, life is like a fishing net. It has holes, knots, and worn-out patches. But if you know how to weave and mend it, you can still catch plenty of beautiful fish." At the time, I only nodded, not truly grasping the weight of his words. Now, at this age, I finally understood. Catherine and I had mended our net. We had endured, faced the holes torn open by that video, and the betrayal, untangled the knots of hatred and bitterness left by Thomas and Anthony, and accepted the frayed scraps of the past. And together, we kept catching moments of joy, tenderness, and closeness. Little silver fish glistening in the sunlight, turning our story not into a sorrowful ending, but into a new chapter filled with serenity and gratitude. This is my story. A story of love, betrayal, hatred, and in the end, forgiveness. A story that even in the darkest of hours, when everything seems lost, there is always a light, no matter how small, as long as we have the courage to keep moving forward. If this story touches your heart, if it makes you reflect on your own relationships, on the choices you have made, and the ones you will face, then I have fulfilled my purpose. I hope that through the story of an old man here in Harmony Creek, you will find a little hope, a little inspiration to choose forgiveness over resentment, to rebuild instead of destroy, and to love as fully as you can. The sun had already set. Darkness fell over the hills. But on my porch, the warm yellow light had just been switched on by Catherine, shining across two aging faces smiling at each other. It was the light of a new beginning, of a love that had found peace in its own imperfection. I know that many of you may also be going through challenges in life, heavy secrets, difficult choices between anger and compassion. I wonder, have you ever stood at a crossroads where you had to decide whether to hold on to bitterness or choose the path of forgiveness? And how did that choice change your life? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts. I truly want to hear from you. I always read every comment, because I believe every story, every experience deserves to be heard. And while you're at it, where are you watching this video from? Tell me your city or your state. I'd love to know that I'm being heard from every corner of the country. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story of an old man. Life is short, my friends. Love, forgive, and find peace in your own imperfection. I wish all of you peace and good health always.